Well, good morning. I know this is another more of a detail press time that we're moving into something that maybe some people don't care about, but I think is really important around here, how the process works. And so we wanted to lay out some guidelines about where the Senate is going to be, what we're looking for when we put forth our budget, and also when the governor releases his budget next week. And that's why we wanted to do it now, 4 pillars that we're looking at about what we want to do and how we want to do it. And so the first one is caring for people. We want to make sure that when we're looking at the things that we're doing, that it shows that we care for people. So that's your seniors and looking at the age wave coming and many people needing long-term care. It's children, it's people with disabilities, people that need to know that Minnesota cares for them. And sort of like the governor's moral document, for us it's another way of saying that we want to care for people. So the second one, you again. So the second one is protecting the taxpayer. We want to make sure that as we're releasing bills and looking at overall budget, that we've protected the taxpayer. And so there's a number of reasons why we want to lay it out there, but Minnesota is one of the higher tax states. My preference would be that we were not in the top 10, but we're in the top 5. But so we want to make sure that when we make policy decisions that we're protecting the taxpayer. There are states like Colorado that are similar in population and yet have significantly lower taxes than Minnesota. So we want to pay attention. Does what we do protect the taxpayer? The third one, we want to control spending and hold government accountable. And so it sort of dovetails into the second one that I mentioned. But how do we hold government accountable? And so that's where we're looking at, are we looking at reforms? Are we doing anything that bends spending curves? Are we addressing waste, fraud, and abuse? There's a number of issues that we've talked about over the last few years where there is fraud or there is waste, and so we want to make sure that we're controlling a whole government spending and making them accountable. And finally, we want to show and say that we want this to be a transparent process, and so that we want to know that this process is transparent, so you're aware of what's happening, and that we're committed to getting done on time. And so even with our joint press conference with the governor and the speaker, laying out deadlines that have never been laid out there before, so that we can actually get done on time, committing to not doing omnibus prime bills, but actually trying to keep bills within their subject. All of that points to the fact that we're trying to be transparent and focused on getting done on time. So the next step is the governor's release of his budget. Then we have the February forecast that comes back beyond that another week or so, and then we will present where we're going to be on our budget. And so it's a process, but these are the pillars that we're laying out so that when the governor lays out his budget, we'll compare that to these principles, and then you'll hear my comments according to that. Any questions on that?
Sure. So you talked about controlling spending, and as inflation grows, tell me a little bit about areas maybe that you could see cutting in order to keeping that cost down.
So I don't think that anything is going to be cut. It's how do you control the increase in spending? That's the problem. I mean, you look at our budget 8 years ago, and it's now 39% higher than 8 years ago. And so we can factor in inflation. Inflation is part of it. We can factor in population growth, but spending is above that. And unfortunately in government, automatic spending increases are not called spending increases. They're just, so anytime we reduce those, that's called a cut in government. In your own home and your family, anytime money goes up, that's an increase, but in government, it's only called an increase if it's above the spending projection. So that's why we say control spending. And the HHS has some very large spending increases that are automatic. Is there a way that we can bend those spending curves so that it's not as much of an increase?
Your materials reference the most robust rainy day fund in state history. Are you planning to tap into that in any way?
I do not want to tap into our rainy day fund. It's all funds combined, near $2 billion. That's the highest it's ever been. It really should be for recessions because we have cycles that go down. We're not in a recession now, so it would be my desire not to touch that.
You guys seem to be trying to make distinction between omnibus prime and regular run-of-the-mill omnibus bills,
Yep.
meaning committee bills. Do you have standards for what can be in committee bills, meaning things that haven't been heard before, can they be put into a committee bill? Can a conference come out of a committee, a conference on a committee bill come out with things that have not been in either side's original bills? Do you have any rules on that this year?
No, I don't think there's going to be a lot of change in the actual budget bills that are coming forward. That means HHS, K-12, higher ed, et cetera. They're typically a combination of the target that we give them for spending and also policy that both sides want. I think you're going to see the governor have policy that he wants, and we're going to have different policy that we want, and that'll be part of the negotiating process, but that shouldn't change. But having a large spending bill that combines all areas into one is what we're trying to avoid.
Do you have to pretend that there's a financial aspect to that policy to get it into that?
No.
Or will you allow policy generally on state government operations to
Yep.
go into that?
Yeah, policy does not have to be linked to finances to be in a bill, and that's common.
Some of the measures that are moving forward right now, elder abuse, opioid epidemic, getting a handle on that, are going to cost some money. So is that going to take away from other areas in the budget, or without increasing spending?
Yeah.
How is that going to work?
Sure. I mean, we have at this point, before the February forecast, we have about a $1.5 billion surplus, and so that's what people are vying for new spending. And there are a number of issues. You mentioned opioids and safe schools, broadband. There's a number of areas where people are asking for money. That's one-time money normally. But that is a factor. And if we do pass one of those bills early, for example, we're looking at the Granny Cam bill as far as, that has a small fiscal note or small cost. And so that will affect the end product at the end, but that doesn't mean we wouldn't do it early anyway.
And do you see those one-time spending as the most appropriate use for the surplus, given financial projections?
Can you repeat that one more time?
I was just wondering whether you see those one-time spending items that you mentioned as, the most appropriate use of the surplus, given the financial outlook going forward.
So one-time money simply means it's here now and it's not projected to be there moving forward. And so we're open to, and that will be a decision that's made, frankly, between the House, Senate, and Governor. Are some of those monies best used applying to some of the issues that we know are important? So one of them in Minnesota that I believe is important is making sure our schools are safe. That's an issue that we had last year that roughly 1/3 of that got through. The rest was vetoed by the governor. And so that's one that I think we ought to consider, but we're all going to weigh in on that one, and that one, time will tell what it exactly is.
Mr. Leader, since Senator James is here, I can't resist this one on reinsurance specifically. And maybe you can, Mr. Leader, as well, talk about this. The Democrats on the House side seem to be going along with this. There's some resistance on the part of Democrats in the Senate. Now, they don't have the majority, obviously, but there was concern about the long-term budgetary implications of another round of reinsurance. Please.
Well, thank you, and I think that the answer to that would be that we are working also on a lot of reform bills, and I choose to do the two bills separate. I'd rather have the reinsurance bill travel as the reinsurance bill, the reform bill travel as a reform bill. But I think what this does is it gives us another 2 years to work on reform, and that reform can start driving down those costs. And if we look at the market today, look at what's available, and look at all the options, that's probably the best option that we have right now. And one of it that makes it a very good option is the fact that this very likely will move forward for the next 2 years without any additional funding, because the cost of reinsurance is considerably lower than what we expected it would be. And with those lower costs, that drives out the amount of money that we put into it 2 years ago. That extends the period that will cover it. We had a 5-year waiver from the federal. We've used 2 years of that. So we still have 3 more years left on that waiver. So this bill extends that out by 3 years.
Without increasing the cost.
Without any new dollars.
And the point made, I understand, in committee yesterday, but one of the things that Senator Hayden said was, even that aside, or at least this was the sense of what he said, I think, even that aside, we were 2 years ago, we were saying we were gonna do this in 2 years from now, and now we're at the 2-year point, and now we're saying another 2 years. When is it actually gonna happen? I think it's the point that he made for folks that are in the individual market. When are we actually gonna see some change? We were talking about a couple of years ago is what he's saying.
And I think that's a very good question, and the answer to that is that in the last 2 years, we've had task force working on different reforms and looking at different ways we can reform the market and reform the services that are being provided. And so we spent 2 years working on that. Now we have a lot of bills coming forward that actually do cause some reform or do create reform, which should start driving the price down. So you can look back at the last 2 years and say, what did you do? And that's a very fair question. What we did was worked on having various work groups and stuff working on the reform and also on looking at different ways we could do, to work with the insurance costs. And I think now the next 2 years, we have a lot of that stuff laid out. Now we can start moving those things forward, and that'll eventually, we hope, drive the cost down. I assume it'll drive the cost down. I think it will, but that remains to be seen.
A question for the leader, if I may, and then I'll leave this one. There are folks who are saying, again, the HMOs are driving this. They came to the well a couple of years ago with reinsurance. Now they're gonna get another chunk, and therefore there's really no impetus for the reforms that Senator Deems is talking about.
So the first purpose to reinsurance the last couple of years was to stabilize the market. There were literally providers that were going to leave the state or were considering leaving the state. So it was successful in that regard, that we literally stabilized the market. Insurance rates went down for the people there over the last 2 years. Over the prior 2 years without it, rates had gone up significantly. And so I don't believe that's the main reason that, as far as the HMOs. We knew that we had to stabilize the market. We knew that we needed providers in all 50 states, or I'm sorry, all 87 counties. Typo there. But anyway, and we accomplished that. So.
Because healthcare is such a huge chunk of the state budget, how is the sunsetting of the healthcare access fund going to be factored into this budget planning?
So I've said in earlier press conferences that will be one of the big issues of this budget cycle. In 2011, the provider tax was bill passed so that it would sunset this year, and so that's going to happen. The question is, where can we reduce the growth of spending in HHS to make up the difference? I believe the fund runs out in, I think it's 2021. And so we know that we have to work towards reform. We know that we have to address waste and fraud in there, and that will be the big discussion. Governor Walz wants to continue, or we would say raise the tax because it is going away. And so that's where his position is, so we're exactly opposite on that position. And so that'll be one of those sparring places that the governor talked about earlier.
Will you include a tax conformity piece in your budget proposal? Forgive me if you covered that at the top of your meeting here today.
You're late.
I know I am. I apologize.
No, I'm sorry. Just kidding.
No.
Certainly, that will have to be part of the overall package. Is what does our tax bill look like? We have the finance chair here today that deals with all of the spending part, but then you have that other piece, which is tax conformity and tax relief. And so we're working now to decide how they fit together. We really have to wait for the February forecast before we are going to put out anything that we would put out. Unfortunately, the governor has to go before the February forecast. It makes it a little more difficult for him. But so that will be part of what we're looking at.
Have you taken the last two state finance reports on tax collections as a warning sign, where they've shown a drop in actual revenue versus anticipated?
Yeah, so January numbers came back over $200 million less. So we have to see what is the February number. Some people think it was related to the federal shutdown. Did that rebounce after they worked out a deal? That's the part we have to wait and see. But clearly, if we have less money, it makes our job even more difficult. But that's what we have to wait and see.
Mr. Leader, the governor signaled that possibly part of his budget may be a permanent middle income tax decrease, tax decrease for middle income folks. Is that doable? Does it have to happen in conjunction with business tax reductions? From your caucus standpoint, what's the appetite for that?
Yeah, I would say take a look at last year's tax bill that Republicans in the House and Senate put together that was vetoed by the governor. It had a reduction in the lowest income tax rate and the middle class tax rate. And so it can be done. I don't know what the package is going to look like. We have a brand new House that will argue for other things, and so we'll see. So.
May I ask just one more? There was an interesting little bill in the House committee yesterday that would allow school districts to reauthorize or continue operating levies, not bond capital improvements, but operating levies without taxpayer approval. Looks like it's got fairly good support in the House. Any appetite for that in the Senate, Mr. Leader?
Well, I will let our education chair work on that. My opinion is I like the fact that the local communities can decide yes or no on whether they want to have more spending in their local schools. There's also a lawsuit that Minnesota is in that basically says we're not doing education funding properly. So there's a number of variables there, but I do like the fact that local districts and their voters can decide what kind of money they want to spend on a local level. So.
In other words, school districts doing it without voter approval is not something that you would care for?
That's my opinion. Yep.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
Very good. Thank you, sir.